The late autumn wind swept through the empty outdoor seating area of Bistro Nouveau, rattling the carefully arranged place settings that would remain untouched for another season. Adam Marshall stood at the window of his office above the restaurant, watching leaves spiral across the courtyard as he turned the crisp envelope over in his hands. The paper was expensive, the kind that spoke of old money in careful cultivation of appearances. His name was written in perfect calligraphy on the front, Mr. Adam Marshall, Private and Confidential. The letter had arrived that morning, hand-delivered to his home before he'd left for work. Claire, his wife of 15 years, had brought it to him with a slight furrow in her brow that he'd learned to read as concern. "It looks important," she'd said, her fingers lingering on the envelope a moment too long before releasing it. Now, hours later, he still hadn't opened it. Something about the weight of it, the formality, stirred memories he'd rather leave undisturbed. His father had received letters like this, always followed by long nights in his study, heated phone calls in whispered tones, and the subtle shift in the household atmosphere that signaled trouble on the horizon. His phone buzzed, Claire's name appearing on the screen. "Have you opened it yet?" Adam sighed, running his thumb under the seal. "Doing it now. I'll call you back." The paper inside was just as luxurious as its envelope, the letterhead bearing a simple VR in understated serif font. As he read, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Dear Mr. Marshall. Your father, Jonathan Marshall, and I had certain arrangements that remained unresolved at the time of his passing. I've allowed appropriate time for mourning, but now we must address these matters. The sum of $2.5 million, plus agreed-upon interest, remains outstanding. I trust you understand the importance of honoring family obligations. I will contact you soon to discuss terms. Regards. Vincent Romano." Adam's hand trembled slightly as he set the letter down. His father had been gone for 18 months of carefully rebuilding the family's restaurant empire, expanding from the original Bistro Nouveau to a chain of successful establishments across 3 states. He'd done it the right way, no shortcuts, no backroom deals, none of the shadows that had always seemed to lurk at the edges of his father's success. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Marshall. There's someone here to see you. Says he's an old friend of your father's. Send them away, Susan. I'm not Dash. He says it's about Vincent Romano." The name sent a chill through him. He'd only just read it, and already it was materializing in his life like a summoned spirit. "Give me a minute." Adam called Claire back, his voice tight with tension. "It's about Dad. Someone claiming he's owed money." "How much?" Claire's voice was carefully neutral, but he could hear the underlying tension. $2.5 million. Plus interest. There was a long pause. "It's a scam, Adam. It has to be. Your father wouldn't dash." "Wouldn't what?" "Wouldn't borrow money from questionable sources. Wouldn't keep secrets." Adam's laugh was bitter. "You didn't grow up in that house, Claire. You didn't see the parade of business associates at all hours, the mysterious deposits that kept us afloat during the lean years. Listen to me," Claire's voice took on an urgency he rarely heard. "Don't meet with anyone. Don't agree to anything. We need to talk about this in person. There are things you don't dash. Mr. Marshall." Susan's voice came through again. "He's being quite insistent." "I have to go," Adam cut Claire off. "We'll talk tonight." "Adam, wait dash." He ended the call, straightening his tie as he moved toward the door. The man waiting in his outer office was older, probably in his 70s, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of a life lived hard. He wore an impeccably tailored suit that somehow made him look more dangerous rather than refined. "Mr. Marshall," the man extended his hand. "Frank Castellano. I was your father's financial advisor, you might say." Adam didn't take the offered hand. "Funny, I don't remember seeing you at his funeral. Some debts are better discussed with the living." Frank's smile didn't reach his eyes. Vincent asked me to assess your willingness to cooperate. The interest is accumulating, you understand. And there are other costs to consider. What costs? Information can be valuable, Mr. Marshall. Your father understood that. He paid well to keep certain information contained. Frank reached into his jacket, producing a thick envelope. Consider these a sample of what might become public knowledge. Adam took the envelope, his mouth dry. Inside were photographs, his father at various meetings, passing envelopes, shaking hands with men whose faces had appeared in news reports about organized crime. And more disturbingly, recent photos of Adam himself, at his children's school, at business meetings, at dinner with Claire. You've been watching me. Vincent likes to understand his investments. Frank stood, adjusting his cuffs. You have 1 week to arrange initial payment. Vincent will contact you directly with terms. After Frank left, Adam sat at his desk for a long time, staring at the photos. His phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from Claire, but he couldn't bring himself to respond. The careful life he'd built, the legitimate success he'd achieved, it was all balanced on the foundation his father had laid. And now that foundation was crumbling. In the growing darkness of his office, Adam finally allowed himself to wonder, what else had his father left behind? And more troubling still, what did Claire know that she wasn't telling him? The house was dark when Adam finally pulled into the driveway, save for the warm glow from the kitchen window. He sat in his car for a long moment, watching Claire's silhouette move back and forth behind the curtains. 15 years of marriage, and he'd never seen her keep secrets, until now. The subtle shift in her voice during their phone call, the way she'd held back information, it felt like watching hairline cracks spread across fine china. When he entered, Claire was waiting at the kitchen island, 2 untouched glasses of wine before her. She'd changed from her morning business attire into comfort clothes, his old Harvard sweatshirt, worn soft with age, and yoga pants. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, revealing the worry lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when they'd first met. The kids? He asked, shrugging off his coat. Sophie's at volleyball practice. James is at debate club. We have an hour. She pushed one of the wine glasses toward him. Show me the letter. He placed both the letter and the envelope of photographs on the counter between them. Claire's hands trembled slightly as she read, her face growing paler with each line. When she reached for the photographs, Adam caught her wrist. Before you look at these, he said quietly, I need you to tell me what you were trying to say on the phone. What don't I know, Claire? She met his gaze, and for the first time in their marriage, he saw real fear there. Your father, he wasn't just involved with dangerous people, Adam. He was destroying lives. Including my father's. The kitchen seemed to tilt slightly. What are you talking about? Claire took a long breath, squaring her shoulders. Remember how we met? At that charity gala for struggling restaurants? Of course. You were representing the foundation, reviewing grant applications. I was there looking for your father. Her voice had gone flat, controlled. 6 months earlier, my father's restaurant chain had gone bankrupt. 3 generations of my family's work, gone overnight. The health department citations, the tax audit, the sudden exodus of suppliers, it seemed like horrible luck at the time. My father. Her voice cracked. He had a stroke from the stress. Died 3 months later. Adam felt the floor dropping away beneath him. Claire dash. It took me months to piece it together, she continued, her voice gaining strength. Your father wanted to expand into the suburbs, but our restaurants had all the prime locations. So he orchestrated our downfall. Paid off health inspectors, threatened suppliers, had his friends in the tax office launch an investigation. By the time I had proof, he'd already bought our locations for pennies on the dollar. Adam sank onto a bar stool, memories rearranging themselves like pieces of a broken mirror. That's why you were so interested in me at the gala. You were investigating him. At first, yes. Claire's eyes filled with tears. But then I got to know you. You were nothing like him, Adam. You were kind, and honest, and... She reached for his hand. I fell in love with you despite everything. And when I saw how you wanted to run the business differently, how you treated people with respect, I decided the past should stay buried. Does Vincent Romano have something to do with what happened to your family? Claire's face went very still. That name. I found it in some of my father's old papers. There were notes about a loan, about someone named Vincent who could solve the problem. But my father was too proud. He refused to borrow money, said he'd rather lose everything than be in debt to people like that. A sharp knock at the front door made them both jump. Through the glass panels, they could see a tall figure standing on the porch, his face hidden in shadow. Adam Marshall. The voice was cultured, with a hint of an accent. I believe it's time we discussed your father's debt. And perhaps. There was a pause. Your wife's family history as well. Claire's hand found Adam's, squeezing tight. In that grip, he felt decades of buried pain, of carefully maintained secrets, of a love that had somehow flourished in soil poisoned by the past. The house felt suddenly very large and very empty, the space between them and the front door stretching like a chasm. Don't open it, Claire whispered, but they both knew it was too late. The past had finally caught up with them, wearing Vincent Romano's face and carrying the weight of two families' sins. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. In the distance, they heard the sound of car doors opening and closing, more visitors arriving. Their hour of privacy had run out, and with it, the luxury of choosing which truths to face. The moments before opening the door stretched like pulled taffy, sweet with memories suddenly turned bitter. Adam looked at Claire, really looked at her, seeing for the first time the weight she'd carried all these years. How many quiet dinners, family celebrations, and shared dreams had been shadowed by unspoken truths? How had she found the strength to build a life with him, knowing what his father had done? Whatever happens, he said softly, we face it together. Claire nodded, squeezing his hand one last time before letting go. When Adam opened the door, the man standing there wasn't what he'd expected. Vincent Romano was tall and lean, with silver-streaked dark hair and eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He wore an elegant charcoal suit that spoke of old-world tailoring, and his smile was genuine, if predatory. Mrs. Marshall, Vincent's voice was warm as he stepped inside, uninvited. Or should I say, Claire Rossi. Your father, Marco, was a man of principle. His restaurants were legendary, the kind of places where families celebrated life's precious moments. His eyes flickered around the kitchen, taking in the carefully chosen decor, the family photos, the life Claire and Adam had built. Such a shame about that final health inspection. Rats in the kitchen, wasn't it? Strange, considering your father was famous for his immaculate standards. Claire's face had gone pale, but her voice was steady. Why are you here, Mr. Romano? After all these years? Please, call me Vincent. He settled onto a bar stool as if he'd been invited for dinner, two large men in dark suits positioning themselves by the front door. I'm here because Jonathan Marshall left certain debts unpaid. But more importantly, I'm here because stories need proper endings. The money my father borrowed, Adam interjected, what was it really for? Vincent's smile deepened. Ah, now that's the interesting question. Jonathan came to me desperate, not for himself, you understand, but for you, Adam. The health department was threatening to shut down all his restaurants. Something about systematic violations, evidence of corruption. It would have meant prison time. He paused, letting the words sink in. He needed money to make the problems disappear. But more than that, he needed someone else to take the fall. The truth hit Adam like a physical blow. My father set up Claire's family to take the blame. Marco Rossi was the perfect scapegoat, Vincent confirmed. Respected, successful, and completely innocent. When the evidence pointed to his restaurants as the source of the corruption, no one looked deeper. Jonathan kept his freedom, his reputation, and eventually, he even got Marco's prime locations as a bonus. Claire made a small, broken sound. Adam reached for her, but she stepped away, wrapping her arms around herself. The loan, Vincent continued, was substantial. $5 million. Jonathan paid half before his unfortunate accident. The rest, plus interest, falls to you, Adam. Unless what? Unless you're willing to follow in your father's footsteps. I have other businesses that need legitimizing. Your restaurants would be perfect for moving certain funds, making certain connections. No. The word came from Claire, sharp as broken glass. We don't do business that way. Not anymore. Vincent's expression hardened. Mrs. Marshall, given your family history, I'd think carefully about defying me. Your children, Sophie and James, isn't it? Such talented young people. It would be a shame if their futures were compromised by old family scandals coming to light. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Adam felt something shift inside him, a fundamental plate of his world tilting, revealing new depths of understanding. He looked at Claire, saw the steel in her spine, the quiet strength that had allowed her to build a life from the ashes of betrayal. Get out, Adam said quietly. Now. Vincent stood, adjusting his cuffs. You have 24 hours to reconsider. After that, I start making calls. To the press, to the police, to the health department. Everything comes out, your father's crimes, Claire's revenge marriage, all of it. The Marshall restaurant empire will crumble, just like the Rossi legacy did. After Vincent and his men left, the silence in the kitchen was deafening. Claire stood at the sink, staring out into the darkness, her shoulders shaking slightly. A revenge marriage? Adam's voice was rough with emotion. Is that what this was? Claire turned, her face streaked with tears. It started that way. I wanted to understand how Jonathan Marshall's son could be so different from his father. I don't know what I wanted. But then I fell in love with you, and it terrified me. Because loving you meant betraying my father's memory. Every happy moment we shared felt stolen. Adam crossed the kitchen, taking her hands in his. They were cold, trembling. Why did you stay? Because you showed me that legacy isn't destiny. Because watching you build something honest and good helped me believe in second chances. She looked up at him, her eyes fierce despite the tears. Because the life we built together is real, Adam. More real than any revenge could ever be. The sound of a car in the driveway broke the moment, Sophie returning from volleyball practice. Soon, James would be home too. Their children, innocent of the weight of their family's history, would walk through the door expecting nothing more dramatic than dinner and homework help. But in the growing darkness of their kitchen, Adam and Claire faced a truth they couldn't escape. They had 24 hours to find a way out of this maze of old debts and buried sins. And somewhere in their shared past lay the key to their survival, if only they could trust each other enough to find it. The kitchen filled with the quiet sounds of family life, Sophie's volleyball bag hitting the floor, James's debate team folders shuffling onto the counter, the familiar rhythm of children coming home. Claire moved through the motions of dinner preparation with practiced grace, her hands steady now despite the storm raging beneath her calm exterior. Adam watched her, seeing for the first time the quiet strength that had allowed her to build a life in the shadow of such profound loss. Mom, are you okay? Sophie's voice cut through the tension. At 16, she had Claire's intuition, that ability to read the emotional weather of a room. She stood in the doorway, still in her practice clothes, her dark hair falling from its ponytail. You look like you've been crying. Claire turned from the stove, managing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Just a difficult day at work, sweetheart. How was practice? But Sophie's gaze had moved to the wine glasses on the counter, the scattered photographs that they hadn't managed to hide. At 14, James too had gone still, his debate-trained mind picking up the subtle signs of discord. They were their parents' children, too perceptive for simple deflections. Something's wrong, James said quietly. Real wrong. Adam felt the weight of the moment pressed down on him. These children, born of love that had grown in soil poisoned by betrayal, deserved more than inherited shadows. He looked at Claire, saw his own decision reflected in her eyes. Sit down, she said softly. There are things you need to know about your grandfathers. Over the next hour, as the untouched dinner grew cold, Claire and Adam wove together the threads of their family's history. They spoke of Marco Rossi's pride in his restaurants, of Jonathan Marshall's desperate choices, of a young woman who had sought revenge but found love instead. With each revelation, Adam watched his children's faces change, saw them grappling with the complexity of legacy and the weight of unspoken truths. So this man, Vincent, Sophie said finally, her voice tight with emotion, he's threatening to destroy everything unless we pay him? Or become like Grandpa Marshall? We won't let that happen, Adam assured her, but James cut in, his debate training evident in his precise questions. What proof do we have that this debt is even real? If Grandpa Marshall was willing to destroy Mrs. Rossi's family, couldn't this Vincent be running the same kind of scam? Claire's head snapped up, a new light in her eyes. The loan documents, she said suddenly. Your father was meticulous about paperwork, Adam. Even his darkest dealings would have been documented somewhere. The storage unit, Adam breathed. After his father's death, he boxed up the contents of Jonathan's home office, unable to face the task of sorting through them. Everything still there. The next hour was a flurry of activity. Claire called her sister Lisa, a corporate lawyer, setting up an emergency meeting for the morning. Sophie and James were sent upstairs to do homework, though Adam suspected they were really researching Vincent Romano online. And Adam found himself standing in a climate-controlled storage unit, surrounded by the carefully preserved remnants of his father's secret life. I'll take this section, Claire said, pulling on latex gloves before opening the first box. Look for anything related to loans or Romano Enterprises. They worked in focused silence, the only sound the rustling of papers and occasional murmur of discovery. Each box revealed new layers of Jonathan Marshall's dealings, shell companies, offshore accounts, carefully documented betrayals. Adam felt his father's presence in every page, in the meticulous attention to detail that had made his criminal enterprises so successful. Adam. Claire's voice was strange. She held a thin leather portfolio, its pages yellow with age. This is my father's original business plan. The one he wrote when he was 22, starting his first restaurant. Her fingers trembled as she turned the pages. Your father must have taken it when he. Adam moved to her side, seeing the tears falling onto the aged paper. In that moment, watching his wife cradle this relic of her father's dreams, he understood something fundamental about healing. It wasn't about erasing the past or even forgiving it, it was about finding the strength to build something new from the broken pieces. There's more, Claire whispered, pulling out a stack of photographs. They showed Marco Rossi in his restaurants, proud and smiling, surrounded by happy customers and staff. And in the background of several shots, barely noticeable unless you were looking for him, was Vincent Romano. He knew my father, Claire said, her voice hollow. All this time. Vincent wasn't just Jonathan's connection. He was there at the beginning, watching, waiting. The sound of footsteps outside the storage unit made them both freeze. Through the partially open door, they could see shadows moving, hear the murmur of familiar voices. Frank Castellano's gravelly tone carried clearly. Check every unit. Mr. Romano wants those documents found before they can be used. And if the marshals are here. He paused significantly. Make sure they understand the consequences of digging too deep into the past. Claire's hand found Adam's in the darkness, their fingers intertwining as they had so many times before. But this time, the gesture wasn't just about comfort or love, it was about survival. They were surrounded by boxes containing evidence of two families' destruction, with Romano's men closing in, and somewhere in this paper maze lay the truth that could either save them or destroy them completely. In the dim light of the storage unit, Claire's breath came in quiet, measured intervals, a technique she'd learned in therapy years ago, when the grief of losing her father had threatened to overwhelm her. Adam watched her hands move steadily through the documents, her composer's fingers sorting through the remnants of their father's intertwined tragedies. Even now, facing imminent danger, she showed the same quiet strength that had allowed her to rebuild her life from the ashes of betrayal. "There's a back exit," Adam whispered, gesturing toward the far end of the climate-controlled building. "If we move quietly dash." "No." Claire's voice was soft but firm. "I'm done running from the past, Adam. These papers." She held up the portfolio containing her father's original business plan. "This isn't just about money anymore. This is about truth." The footsteps grew closer, echoing off metal doors. In the confined space, Adam felt the weight of choices pressing down on him, not just his own, but the cascading consequences of decisions made decades ago by men who thought they could control the future through force of will and carefully documented deceit. "Claire," he started, but she was already pulling out her phone, typing rapidly. "Lisa needs to see these documents," she said, her camera flash briefly illuminating the space as she photographed page after page. "Not just the loan papers, everything. The health inspection reports, the tax documents, the proof of how they destroyed my father's business." Her voice caught, but her hands remained steady. "And something else. Look at this." She handed him a series of photographs, these older than the ones they'd found earlier. They showed a much younger Vincent Romano standing with two other men outside a restaurant. One was clearly Marco Rossi, proud and smiling in his chef's whites. The other. "That's my father," Adam breathed. "But this must be 30 years ago, before either of us was born. They knew each other all along." The sound of a key in the storage unit's lock made them both freeze. Claire's hand found Adam's in the darkness, squeezing once, not in fear, but in solidarity. Years of shared life, of love built on the ruins of their father's choices, had led them to this moment. The door began to roll up, fluorescent light spilling into their sanctuary of secrets. Frank Castellano's silhouette appeared, flanked by two younger men whose suit jackets couldn't quite conceal their weapons. "Mr. and Mrs. Marshall," Frank's voice carried a note of weary disappointment. "Mr. Romano was hoping you'd be more cooperative." "Tell Vincent we know the truth," Claire said, stepping forward. Her voice carried the weight of years of carefully contained pain, of dignity preserved in the face of devastating loss. "About how he played both our fathers against each other. About how he orchestrated everything, the loans, the corruption, the destruction of my family's business. It wasn't just about money, was it? This was personal." Frank's expression flickered, just enough to confirm her words. "Mrs. Marshall, you're making assumptions based on dash." "Based on evidence," Adam cut in, understanding finally dawning. "Vincent Romano wanted both restaurants, ours and the Rossi's. He played my father's greed against Marco's pride, knowing one would destroy the other. And when it was done, he'd own the survivor through debt and blackmail." "The game's more complex than you understand," Frank said softly. "Your fathers were both pawns in a larger strategy. Vincent's been building his empire for decades, piece by piece. The restaurants are just the legitimate face of it. What he really wants is your distribution network, your supplier relationships, your clean reputation. Perfect for moving certain products." "That's not going to happen," Adam said firmly. Frank sighed, reaching into his jacket. "Then I'm afraid dash." "I'm afraid you're under arrest," a new voice cut through the tension. Detective Sarah Chen stepped into view, her badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Behind her, a team of officers moved with practiced efficiency, weapons drawn. Frank Castellano, we've been building a case against Romano's organization for years. Thank you for that lovely confession. Claire's sister Lisa appeared next, digital recorder in hand. Got it all, Sarah. Clear as day. She turned to Claire and Adam, tears in her eyes. When Claire called, said you were heading here. I knew we had to move fast. Sarah's been working the Romano case for months. As Frank and his men were led away in handcuffs, Claire sank to her knees among the scattered papers of their shared history. Adam knelt beside her, gathering her into his arms as the walls they'd built around their pain finally crumbled. All these years, she whispered against his shoulder, I thought I was alone in carrying this weight. But you were carrying it too, weren't you? In your own way. Adam thought of the careful steps he'd taken to build his business legitimately, the constant fear that he'd somehow become his father without realizing it. We both tried so hard to outrun our father's shadows, he said softly. Maybe it's time to step into the light instead. Detective Chen approached, her expression gentle. We'll need your statements, and all these documents will have to be logged into evidence. But first. She hesitated. There's someone else you should talk to. Someone who's been waiting a very long time to set things right. Through the open door of the storage unit, they could see an elderly man waiting in the gathering dawn. His once powerful frame was stooped with age, but his eyes were clear and filled with unshed tears. Uncle Joe. Claire breathed in disbelief. My father's brother. The man who had once been Vincent Romano's closest friend and eventual betrayer stepped forward, holding out a thick envelope. I have letters, he said, his voice rough with emotion. From both your fathers. Written before everything fell apart. I think it's time you knew the whole story. Dawn crept through the windows of Bistro Nouveau, painting the empty dining room in shades of gold and amber. Adam and Claire sat at their usual corner table, the one where they'd celebrated countless family milestones, where their children had done homework between dinner service rushes, where they'd built their life one quiet moment at a time. Uncle Joe's letters lay between them, their pages worn soft with years of careful preservation. I couldn't bring myself to share these before now. Joe Rossi's hands trembled as he poured coffee, his movements carrying the weight of decades of silence. Your fathers, they were good men who lost their way. The truth nearly destroyed them both in the end. Claire reached for the first letter, her father's familiar handwriting bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. Read it with me, she asked Adam softly. He moved his chair closer, their shoulders touching as they began to read. My dearest friend Jonathan. By the time you read this, Vincent's plan will already be in motion. He's offered me the same devil's bargain he gave you, sacrifice our friendship to save our families. But I've learned something that changes everything. The money he's using to corrupt our businesses, to turn us against each other, comes from darker places than we imagined. I can't let my daughter inherit a legacy built on blood money. Better to lose everything with honor than to save it through complicity. Whatever happens next, know that I forgive you. We were both fathers trying to protect our children, both blind to the true enemy. With hope for a better future. Marco. Adam's hand found Claire's, steadying her as she reached for the second letter, his father's response, never sent. Marco. I received your warning too late. The choices I've made, thinking I was protecting my son's future, have instead poisoned it. Vincent's web is vast, and I fear I've entangled both our families beyond redemption. I've gathered evidence of everything, the money laundering, the forced bankruptcies, the web of corruption that Vincent has spent decades weaving. It's hidden where he'll never find it, waiting for the day when our children might need to understand the truth. Claire, if you're reading this, your father was a better man than I ever was. The love you've shown my son, despite everything I did to your family, is a grace I don't deserve but am profoundly grateful for. Adam, my son, I failed you in so many ways, but you've built something honest and true from the ashes of my mistakes. Protect it. Protect them. The strength of your character has always been your own, never an inheritance from me. With deep regret and endless love. Jonathan. The silence that followed was full of understanding, of paths not taken, of wounds beginning to heal, of truth finally setting roots in soil long poisoned by lies. Joe cleared his throat, pulling out one final document. There's more, he said quietly. Vincent didn't just want the restaurants. He needed them to legitimize his entire operation. But Marco and Jonathan, in their final days, they left us a way to end this. Together. The document was a detailed account of Vincent's entire operation, compiled over years by two men who discovered their consciences too late to save themselves, but perhaps in time to save their children. Detective Chen had been right, it was exactly what they needed to dismantle Romano's empire completely. Dad knew, Claire whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He knew I'd find my way to Adam, that we'd somehow end up here, looking for answers together. They both knew, Adam agreed, thinking of all the small moments that had led them to this place, Claire's initial quest for revenge transformed into love, his own determination to build something legitimate from his father's tainted legacy, their shared commitment to truth even when it hurt. The sound of the front door opening made them look up. Sophie and James entered, followed by Lisa and Detective Chen. Their children's faces showed the strain of a sleepless night, but also a new kind of understanding, the kind that comes from seeing your parents as whole people, with histories and wounds and the capacity for both terrible mistakes and profound healing. The arrest warrants are being served right now, Sarah Chen said, her professional demeanor softening as she took in the scene. Vincent Romano and his entire organization are going down. Your father's evidence, combined with what we gathered last night, it's over. Sophie moved to stand behind her parents, one hand on each of their shoulders. So what happens now? She asked, her voice carrying that mix of strength and vulnerability that reminded Adam so much of Claire. Now, Claire said, standing slowly, we honor both our father's final wishes. We take what they built, the good and the bad, and we transform it into something new. Something honest. Together, Adam added, looking around at their gathered family, blood and chosen, past and present intertwining in ways he was only now beginning to understand. As the morning light filled the restaurant, Adam thought about legacy, not as something inherited, but as something chosen, built day by day through small acts of courage and love. He thought about his father and Marco Rossi, two men who'd found their moral compass too late to save themselves but just in time to give their children a chance at redemption. Claire moved toward the kitchen, her steps purposeful. I think, she said, looking back at them with a smile that held both sadness and hope, it's time to start today's bread. Dad always said a restaurant without fresh bread was just a building with tables. And in that simple statement, Adam heard everything she wasn't saying, about healing being a daily practice, about honoring the past while building something new, about the quiet courage it takes to keep moving forward. One loaf at a time, one day at a time, they would rebuild their legacy together, stronger for having faced the truth, richer for understanding the cost of silence, and wiser for knowing that love, even love born from revenge, could become something pure and transformative. James moved to help his mother with the bread, while Sophie began setting up for the day's service. Detective Chen and Lisa departed with the documents, carrying with them the evidence of past sins and the promise of justice. And Joe Rossi sat at the corner table, watching his niece's family with tears in his eyes, seeing in their unity the redemption his brother and his friend had hoped for but never lived to see. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the brass nameplate that hung above the door, Marshall and Rossi's Bistro Nouveau. It wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a testament to the power of truth to heal, of love to transform, and of the endless possibility of beginning again.